A child's body lies motionless in the salt marshes of South Boston, April 18, 1874. The morning mist clings to the cattails as police officers wade through the murky water, their faces growing pale at what they discover. 4-year-old Horace Millen, barely more than a toddler, has been stabbed 18 times. His small form, twisted and broken, tells a story of unimaginable cruelty. The wounds are deep, deliberate, savage, the work of someone who took pleasure in every thrust of the blade. Word spreads through the cobblestone streets like wildfire. Mothers clutch their children closer. Fathers demand answers. The Boston police have seen violence before, but nothing like this. Nothing so methodical, so brutal, inflicted upon someone so innocent. They search for clues in the muck and reeds, hoping to find some trace of the monster who could commit such an act. The assumption is simple. This must be the work of a deranged adult, someone lurking in Boston's shadows, preying on the vulnerable. The city braces for a manhunt, expecting to corner some twisted vagrant or escaped lunatic. But as the investigation unfolds, the truth proves far more disturbing than anyone could imagine. The killer wasn't a shadowy man in the night. It was a boy barely older than his victims. 3 years earlier, in the working-class neighborhood of Charlestown, a different kind of darkness was taking root. Jesse Harding Pomeroy was 12 years old, pale as winter morning, with stringy hair that hung around his face like a curtain. His most striking feature was his right eye, clouded by a birth defect, milky white and blind, giving him an unsettling, lopsided stare that made other children uncomfortable. The Pomeroy family lived modestly on Bunker Hill Avenue. Jesse's father, Thomas, struggled with alcoholism and eventually abandoned the family, leaving his wife Ruth to raise Jesse and his younger brother Charles alone. Ruth worked tirelessly, taking in sewing and later opening a small dress shop, but the absence of a father figure left a void that seemed to grow larger with each passing month. Jesse was brilliant, unnaturally so. He devoured books with an intensity that worried his teachers, particularly the blood-soaked dime novels that filled the penny presses. Stories of frontier violence, Indian massacres, and graphic murders became his obsession. While other boys played marbles or baseball, Jesse disappeared into these tales of torture and death, his one good eye scanning every gruesome detail. His intelligence, however, couldn't protect him from the cruelty of other children. They mocked his blind eye, calling him names, excluding him from games. The isolation burned inside him, festering into something poisonous. Where other children might have retreated into sadness, Jesse began to fantasize about revenge, not just against his tormentors, but against anyone smaller and weaker than himself. That isolation became the perfect incubator for darker impulses. Jesse discovered that while he couldn't control how others treated him, he could control how he treated others. The realization was intoxicating. Power, he learned, didn't come from being liked or accepted. It came from being feared. By late 1871, Jesse had begun stalking the younger boys in his neighborhood. He would approach them with false friendliness, luring them to quiet spots near the Chelsea Creek or abandoned lots where no one would hear them scream. What started as verbal threats escalated quickly into physical violence. He would tie his victims to trees, stick them with pins, or beat them with sticks, all while maintaining an eerily calm demeanor. His first known victim was a 7-year-old boy named Billy Payne. Jesse convinced Billy to follow him to a secluded cabin, where he tied him up and tortured him for hours with a knife. When Billy was finally found, his body was covered in cuts and his mind was shattered by trauma. The boy's testimony was fragmented, confused. He spoke of a pale boy with a strange eye who had hurt him for no reason at all. The satisfaction Jesse derived from these encounters was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The fear in their eyes, the way they begged him to stop, their absolute helplessness, It filled a void inside him that nothing else could touch. Each act of cruelty fed a growing appetite that demanded more elaborate, more severe forms of violence. Over the next 2 years, Jesse's attacks became more frequent and more vicious. He developed a pattern: target boys between the ages of 5 and 10, isolate them, and then subject them to increasingly creative forms of torture. He carved his initials into their skin, burned them with matches, and forced them to strip naked in the cold. The psychological component was as important as the physical pain. He wanted to break them completely. Parents in Chelsea and Charlestown began to panic. Stories of the mysterious boy tormentor spread through the community, but Jesse was cunning enough to avoid capture. He varied his hunting grounds, struck at different times of day, and selected victims who were unlikely to provide clear descriptions. His partial blindness, ironically, became an asset. People remembered his strange eye, but in their fear and confusion, they often couldn't provide useful details about anything else. The attacks were creating a reign of terror among local families, but they were just preparation for something far worse. In March 1874, Jesse's mother Ruth moved the family to South Boston and opened the new dress shop on Broadway. The change of scenery did nothing to curb Jesse's violent urges. If anything, the fresh hunting ground excited him. He had perfected his techniques on the boys of Chelsea and Charlestown, but now he was ready to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. 10-year-old Katie Curran was walking past the Pomeroy dress shop on March 18, 1874, when Jesse spotted her through the window. She was small, alone, and trusting, the perfect victim. He stepped outside and approached her with a smile, telling her that his mother had beautiful ribbons inside that she might like to see. Katie, enchanted by the prospect of pretty things, followed him into the shop. Ruth Pomeroy was out running errands. Jesse and Katie were alone. What happened next would haunt investigators for months to come. Jesse led the little girl down to the cellar, ostensibly to show her more merchandise. Once they were out of sight, he struck her on the head with a stone, crushing her skull. The violence was swift and decisive. This wasn't torture, it was murder. Katie's body was hidden in the cellar's ash heap, covered with dirt and debris. When Ruth returned, Jesse acted as if nothing had happened. Katie's disappearance was reported to police, but without witnesses or evidence, the investigation stalled. She became just another missing child in a city where children sometimes wandered off or fell victim to accidents. Her family searched desperately, posting notices and offering rewards, but Katie Curran seemed to have vanished into thin air. The killing unleashed something primal in Jesse. He had crossed the ultimate boundary, taken a life, and felt nothing but satisfaction. The power was absolute. He had decided that Katie Curran would cease to exist, and now she didn't. It was intoxicating beyond anything he had experienced during his torture sessions. The random cruelty of his earlier attacks no longer seemed sufficient. Jesse began to plan something grander, more theatrical. Less than a month later, on April 18, 1874, Jesse encountered 4-year-old Horace Millen playing near his family's bakery. Horace was even younger than Katie, barely out of toddlerhood, with a trusting nature that made him an easy target. Jesse approached the child with practiced charm, telling him about a wonderful place where they could see boats and maybe catch some fish. Horace, eager for adventure, took the strange boy's hand. Jesse led Horace through the winding streets of South Boston, past the bustling markets and into the quieter residential areas. They walked for nearly an hour, Jesse spinning stories about the magical place they were going to visit. Other children might have grown suspicious or tired, but Horace was captivated by his new friend's attention. The salt marshes stretched out before them like a gray wasteland. Jesse had chosen this location carefully, isolated enough that screams wouldn't be heard, but accessible enough that the body would be discovered. He wanted this killing to be found. He wanted Boston to know what he was capable of. What followed was an explosion of violence that defied comprehension. Jesse pulled out a knife and began stabbing Horace with methodical precision. 18 wounds, each one deliberate, each one designed to cause maximum pain before death mercifully intervened. This wasn't the quick killing of Katie Curran. This was prolonged, sadistic torture that ended in murder. Jesse's confidence in his abilities had grown to the point of carelessness. Unlike his earlier attacks, where he had been meticulous about avoiding witnesses, the Horace Millen murder was witnessed by several people who saw the two boys walking together toward the marshes. When Horace's body was discovered the next morning, these witnesses provided descriptions that led police directly to Jesse Pomeroy. The investigation moved with unprecedented speed. Officers questioned everyone in the neighborhood, piecing together Jesse's movements on the day of the murder. They learned about the strange boy with the blind eye, the one who had been seen with multiple victims over the past few years. When they searched the Pomeroy dress shop, they made a horrifying discovery in the cellar: the decomposed remains of Katie Curran still buried under the ash heap where Jesse had hidden her weeks earlier. The arrest of Jesse Pomeroy sent shockwaves through Boston and beyond. Newspaper headlines screamed about the Boston boy fiend and America's youngest murderer. Editorial writers struggled to make sense of how someone so young could commit acts so heinous. The story captured national attention, with papers as far away as California covering every detail of the case. Boston police had dealt with child criminals before, petty thieves, street urchins who sometimes turned violent, but nothing had prepared them for Jesse Pomeroy. When they arrested him on April 20th, 1874, just 2 days after Horace Millen's body was discovered, they expected to find a traumatized child who might break down under questioning. Instead, they encountered something far more unsettling. Jesse sat calmly in the interrogation room, his blind eye giving him an otherworldly appearance in the dim gaslight. When asked about the murders, he showed no emotion, no remorse, no fear. He denied some charges while admitting to others, with the same flat tone he might use to discuss the weather. "Did you kill Katie Curran?" Detective Wood asked. "I don't remember," Jesse replied, his voice steady and emotionless. "What about Horace Millen? Did you stab that little boy?" A pause. Then, with chilling casualness, "He was bothering me." The detective had interviewed hundreds of criminals, but Jesse's complete lack of human emotion was unlike anything he had ever encountered. There was no pleading, no tears, no attempts to blame others or acclaim innocence. Jesse seemed genuinely puzzled by the adult's distress over what he had done. The trial of Jesse Pomeroy began in December 1874, drawing massive crowds to the Suffolk County Courthouse. Spectators lined up for hours, hoping to catch a glimpse of the boy killer. Inside the courtroom, Jesse sat quietly beside his attorney, occasionally glancing around at the packed gallery with what observers described as mild curiosity. The prosecution painted Jesse as a calculating monster who had systematically escalated from torture to murder. They presented evidence of his earlier attacks, the careful planning of his crimes, and his complete lack of remorse. The defense argued that Jesse was mentally ill, a victim of an abusive childhood and a defective brain that made him incapable of understanding right from wrong. Medical experts examined Jesse extensively, trying to find some physical explanation for his behavior. Phrenologists studied the shape of his skull, looking for abnormalities that might explain his violent tendencies. Alienists, as psychiatrists were then called, interviewed him for hours, searching for signs of insanity that might save him from the gallows. Jesse remained largely silent throughout these examinations, answering questions with minimal responses and showing no interest in helping either his defenders or his accusers. When asked about his victims, he spoke about them as if they were objects rather than human beings. "The little girl was making too much noise," he said of Katie Curran. "I made her stop." The jury deliberated for just 5 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. Judge Horace Gray sentenced Jesse to death by hanging, making him the youngest person ever condemned to execution in Massachusetts. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of satisfaction and unease. Justice had been served, but the prospect of hanging a 14-year-old boy troubled many observers. The death sentence triggered a massive public debate about juvenile justice, mental illness, and the nature of evil itself. Religious leaders argued that executing a child, no matter how heinous his crimes, violated Christian principles. Legal scholars questioned whether someone so young could truly understand the consequences of his actions. Reform advocates used Jesse's case to argue for better treatment of mentally ill children. Governor William Gaston found himself in an impossible position. The law demanded Jesse's execution, but public opinion was deeply divided. After months of deliberation, Gaston commuted the death sentence to life imprisonment in solitary confinement, a compromise that satisfied neither those who wanted Jesse dead nor those who believed he deserved treatment rather than punishment. Jesse was transferred to Charlestown State Prison, where he would spend the next 40 years in a small cell, alone with his thoughts and his crimes. Prison records show that he rarely spoke to guards, spent most of his time reading, and showed no signs of remorse or rehabilitation. He became a living ghost, forgotten by most of the world but never truly gone. Even today, more than a century later, the case of Jesse Harding Pomeroy continues to disturb and fascinate. Modern criminal psychologists study his case as an early example of juvenile psychopathy, noting the textbook progression from animal cruelty to human violence. His crimes anticipated the serial killers who would terrorize later generations, demonstrating that the capacity for evil could emerge shockingly early in life. What makes Jesse's story particularly haunting is not just the brutality of his crimes, but their inexplicable nature. He wasn't driven by poverty, abuse, or mental illness in any conventional sense. He was simply a child who discovered that causing pain gave him pleasure, and who pursued that pleasure with methodical determination until it led him to murder. The boy with the blind eye who could only see the world through a lens of cruelty had shown Boston and America a terrifying truth about human nature. Evil didn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wore the face of a child, spoke with a quiet voice, and struck with the suddenness of lightning on a clear day. Jesse Harding Pomeroy entered Charlestown State Prison as a 14-year-old boy. When he died there in 1932, he was 72 years old, having spent 58 years behind bars. But the darkness that had driven him to kill Katie Curran and Horace Millen, that had led him to torture countless other children, never aged. It remained as fresh and inexplicable on the day he died as it had been on that gray April morning when little Horace Millen's body was found in the salt marshes of South Boston. He entered prison as a boy, but the darkness that sent him there never aged.